Hi, I'm Saxy. I'm a modder for Stardew Valley. In this video, I'll explain the types of questions that could be used in events. Watch the event I prepared and observe the different outcomes. So here's a question. For this type, it doesn't matter which one I pick. There's the next question. What is your favorite music genre? If I click country, it says country. And I can also have an emote. There's another question. Do you want me to tell them you paid for this? If I click yes, of course. This is a fork event from the first answer. Let's try that again. Let's try clicking pop. Now there is a different dialog. And it's also fork events. But notice I didn't answer the other question. Let's try this again. If I click country. Let's click the bottom one this time. No, I'd rather remain anonymous. And this continues the current events. Let's talk about the three main types of questions in events. The first type is question null, which basically does nothing. The player can select any answer and it will not do anything as a result. To do this, set the event command as question null, then quotations. Don't forget that you need a backslash behind a quotation in the script. Then the question hash the first answer, hash the second answer. And you can put more answers separate by hash. Next, the following type of questions can result in answers having different outcomes where the answer chosen by the player can be stored as a flag. This is similar to the concept of mail flags. To save the player's answer, you can use questionAnswered commands when the player encounters it in the event script. Type questionAnswered space a unique answer ID. So I have mod ID underscore my response ID to make it unique. QuestionAnswered by default adds the response ID. Setting true at the end can also add it. To remove the response ID, set it as false. Even though it's not needed, I recommend using questionAnswered in case you change your mind and want to use player's choice to affect an outcome. Response ID and answer ID are synonymous. They can be used as conditions, typically for dialogue to appear. Like for this question commands, if the player selects this second answer, it continues this current events. The player encounters this script, questionAnswered, space this response ID. And later when the player is playing the game, they have this dialogue with Robin. It's on a Friday. There's a condition, $P. If you remember this answer ID, Robin will say this dialogue. If it doesn't match this answer ID, then it will say this dialogue instead. If you go to modding dialogue, formats dialog commands, it can apply to commands that includes response ID. So like this one or this one. The second type of question is quickQuestion, which can result in the player having different outcomes based on the player's answer. To do this, set the event command as quickQuestion. And notice that you do not use quotations for this command. Then space, the question, hash, first answer, hash, second answer, and you can add more answers separated by hash. Then to put what happens when the player chooses an answer, put parentheses break, the commands for the first answer, parentheses break, commands for the second answer, and parentheses break if you have more answers. Notice that if you have multiple commands for an answer, the commands are separated by backslash. If you want the answer to result in showing a diverging event, you can use the command switchEvent and enter the event ID. So for a quickQuestion, when the player selects pop, these commands will activate, and at the end of this command, I put a switchEvent. For switchEvent space mod ID underscore example fork, it will immediately play this event ID. The switchEvent command will continue from the current event. For this event ID, don't make the entry like a normal event ID, which contains preconditions like this. A normal event also contains the 3 required fields. Also remember that you can use questionAnswered for any path. For example, for quickQuestion, if the player selects country, it plays these commands And at the end of this command, I put a question answered and the response ID here. But you can also put the question answer at the end of the fork event ID. For this fork event ID, I put question answered right here. The third type of question is question fork. Question fork is similar to switch events, except it can set a condition for it. To do this, set the event command as question fork, and notice that I have a number at the end of fork. This is an index number that determines which answer is going to diverge into the named event ID. Then we have quotation, the question, hash, the first answer, hash, the second answer, and you can include more answers separated by hash. With fork 0, if the player selects the first answer, it will fork to the listed event ID, which is similar to switch events. Let's look at another example of question fork. Notice for this example, we have question fork 1, which will activate the name event if the player selects the second answer. The fork command can be formatted in a number of ways. Remember that the main difference between question fork and quickQuestion is that question fork can apply a condition. If no condition is needed, then I recommend using quickQuestion because it is generally more simple. However, if you are applying a question fork, then we should look at how it can be formatted. You've seen this format where it is just fork event ID. To apply a condition, you could put a mail ID, response ID, or a game state query in between the fork and event ID. However, if you apply game state query, then you will need quotations. To more easily check for response IDs, I recommend using this mod called Event Repeater. If you scroll down, there is a link for Modder's manual. On the right side, you can click on List Commands, and I might use Show Response. So if I type that into the Smappy console, show response, then it will show the response IDs that I used during the events. There's some other console commands that might be useful. I often use show mail. I sometimes may use show events. And there are other helpful commands and features from this mod, so I recommend downloading it. That's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one.